أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين بالقاسم محمد وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا أما بعد فقد قال أمير المؤمنين بعد فراغه من أمر الخوارج وفيها يتأفف بالناس وينصح لهم بطريق السداد قال أف لكم لقد سئمت إتابكم أرضيتم بالحياة الدنيا من الآخرة عوضا وبالذل من العز خلفا صلوات اللهم صل. I'm going to have to put this in. And I will be starting khutbah number 34 from Nahj al-Balagha. A couple of parts of this khutbah. The first part is Fear of Jihad, titled as Fear of Jihad. Imam alayhi salatu wasalam, in this first portion, as you can see from after mobilizing against the people of Syria, after he had concluded the affair with the Khawarij, Imam now, in it he expresses weariness with the people and advises them toward the path of, coming back and rectitude. And he knows that if he doesn't get them mobilized now while they're still ready, if they go back home and they'll settle down and they'll take off their armor and they'll put away their swords, it'll be very difficult for them to get ready. So here Imam then speaks to them in some harsh words, if you want to call it. The occasion, of course, is delivered the sermon after the end of Nahrawan. From the apparent wordings of Ibn Abil Hadid, it is understood that Imam delivered this sermon in that very land of Nahrawan, where the battle took place. Whereas there are some reports that Imam delivered this sermon in Kufa, and not there, after returning from Nahrawan, observing the tiredness and the slackness of the soldiers in preparing the war against people of Sham. There are other points and elements that lead us to believe where Imam may have given this, that it may have been in Kufa and not over there, primarily because some commentators, Nahj al-Balagha, they have also explicitly stated that at Nahrawan, Imam insisted that army should prepare without delay and move forward towards Syria so that the rest of the people might also join them. Because he knew, as I said before, if they returned back to Kufa and they put away their armor and swords, preparing them would not be easily possible. However, they refused to obey Imam. That was the sad part of it. Seeing Imam of the time in front of him, they still disobeyed his commands on various pretexts, such as weather is cold, we're tired, we just came out of a battle, we got to go to our family and friends, we got to take a breather, all these different excuses. Same thing that we've just been discussing on Tuesday nights about Battle of Tabuk as well, right? In those ayat of Surah Tawbah. Or insufficiency of military weapons. Imam was compelled to come to Kufa and emphasized this whole scenario to them. They should prepare themselves for jihad against the principal enemy. But as had been anticipated, they procrastinated. They showed slackness. It was then that Imam, with utmost distress, delivered this sermon. So, sermon at a glance, if you look at it, there are three parts of it, or three themes that this sermon pursues. First is the large portion of this sermon revolves around emphasizing jihad against the enemy and the grave consequence of abandoning jihad. There was an interesting discussion. One of the Sunni scholars of Pakistan, who resurfaces sometimes, then disappears, then he resurfaces, Dr. Tahir al-Qadri. And in his recent bayan, he was speaking about the Khilafat of Amir al-Mu'mineen, calling him that, of course, he's Khalifa Rashid. And as we mentioned in the previous khutbahs, that the term Khalifa Rashid, when did it come? Towards the time of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, almost end of the first century. But anyways, these four are called Khalifa Rashid. And Rashid means someone who's rightly guided. And so they consider that these four are Musallaman, Khalifa, min Allah, for example. And that's what Allah had intended. So let's just that be the belief. And so he was speaking and condemning his own people for giving Muawiyah such a maqam in the Sunni world. And he was condemning them, saying that for the past 14 centuries, our scholars, meaning the Sunni scholars, have protected Muawiyah, although they all know that he rose against Khalifa Rashid. He rose against Imam Ali, who was the rightly guided Khalifatul Muslimin. And doing jihad against Khalifatul Muslimin is not permissible. And he was wrong. He did khata. And of course, those khata ijtihadi and all that stuff, we had already talked about. He said, but for the past 14 centuries, our akabirin, they said regarding Muawiyah, don't talk about it. Brush it under the carpet. Don't talk about it. There's, it's better not to discuss. Because when you do discuss, there's a possibility some negativity will come about. And plus, because he's Sahabi Rasul, we don't want any, association, bad association to Sahabi Rasul. So, if you know someone in the community who's known for something bad, you say, let's just not talk about it, right? Why bring him into the conversation? Let's just keep him aside. Because that person, for example, it was one of the senior members of the community, served the community for a long time. Now, some of his bad things have surfaced. Let's just not talk about it. Just to protect that person. He said, that's what the hukm of our akabirin, ulama was. Not to discuss him. To protect the sanctity of Sahaba. Otherwise, what he did was wrong. They all agree upon that. But he said, what are you doing now is by celebrating his maulud and practicing all this and, having gatherings about him. All that is contrary to what the ulama had said. This was discussion on around 13th of Rajab maybe. They said, if you should be doing and celebrating the maulud of anyone, it should be Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib. His maulud should be celebrated, not the one who was standing against him in the battle of Siffin, for example. So the major part of this is the abandonment of jihad in this sermon, or in this section of the sermon, which constitutes its major part. This is the major chunk of the sermon. Imam subjects the people of Kufa to a barrage of reproaches. You'll see some harsh words that are come from the very get-go. Reproaches them, sharp and jolting expressions, rebukes them severely. This comes after he had repeatedly mobilized them for jihad against the enemy, which of course knows no limits, no bounds, as you will see. But Imam did not begin with rebuking them from the very beginning. He spoke to them with gentle, compassionate words, like a father to a son, trying to reason with them, using logical means. But he said it is without any effect. They did not have any effect on them. They did not listen. Therefore, he was compelled to resort to this last remedy that is extremely bitter and harsh. He agrees it himself. At times, he likens them to insane people who have lost their understanding and awareness and are unable to distinguish between their own benefits and their own harm. So Imam goes to the extent calling them what? Madmen. You're insane. Because the one who is insane, even in Islamic fiqh, that person does not get to decide about his, wealth, inheritance, and all that stuff. Is not left in his hand. Someone who is his wali gets to decide that. And at times Imam compares them to a wandering camel that have become separated from their camel driver in the desert, completely losing all normal discipline. When a camel is with the driver, it follows certain discipline. Without it, it's got nothing. Then with stern warnings about the merciless and the bloodthirsty enemy awaiting them. All right. In another section of the sermon, Imam speaks of the firm resolve and determination to fight enemy, whether a large group marches with him or only a smaller one. We're going to go. If all of you come, or if only wajib-e-kifai, few of you come. And in the final section of the sermon, he speaks about the mutual rights of Imam and the community. That will be, inshallah, next week. He explains the rights of the community over the Imam, sets forth their principles in 4 brief sentences, and then another 4 meaningful sentences about the rights of the Imam over the community. So inshallah we'll get to that part next week. This sermon, inshallah, shouldn't be too long. This is all there is. And then we get to the ziyarat. So I'll go through this very quickly, inshallah. He says, curse be upon you. Why do you fear martyrdom? So as I said in the first part of this, Imam says, curse be upon you. Uffin lakum, laqad sa'imtu itabakum. I have grown weary from approaching you. Meaning what? I've gone tired of to have to constantly, rebuke you, reproach you, and to tell you and constantly ask you to mobilize. The reason for this weariness is clear. For rebuke, especially from great figures such as Amir al-Mu'mineen, should have a clear effect in stirring those who are reproached and compelling them to reconsider and re-examine their wrongful actions. But when due to the severity of audience's heedlessness, neglect, and the lack of resolve, and being unaware at times, it has no effect and must be repeated. It becomes extremely exhausting. Then he adds, he says, أَرَضِيتُمْ بِالْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا مِنَ الْآخِرَةِ إِوَزًا وَبِالذُّلِّ مِنَ الْعِزِّ خَلَفًا. Have you accepted the lowly life of this world in place of the life of the hereafter? Because that's where you are treading. That's the direction that you are heading into. Hereafter, which is blissful and everlasting, and in exchange for honor and dignity, because if you stand up, fight for your life, fight for your land, fight for yourself, and for your deen, there's honor in it. And if you don't, there's disgrace in it. You've chosen misery and humiliation. This deadly silence of your fight, or flight rather, from jihad, show that on one hand, you have ruined your hereafter, because you clearly don't care about this deen which is now under attack. For you have exchanged it for a few fleeting days of this world. And on the other hand, you have destroyed your worldly life as well. خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ, as the Quran says. خَسِرَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. The people, they have lost the world and the hereafter. They don't have either one. And therefore, for you have traded honor and dignity for humiliation. How have you lost the world? You're living in a disgraceful life. You're living with humility. And you've been humiliated every single day. Do you expect to be enslaved of this world? Someone else being your master and ruling over you and running you around as a slave? What kind of life is that? Whereas death with honor is far nobler than the life accompanied with humiliation. Remember those beautiful words of Imam Hussein in Karbala as well. When Imam says, "Ala wa inna da'i ibn da'i qad rakkazani bayna ithnayn bayna sillati wa dhillati hayhat min az-zillah." Hayhat min az-zillah, right? Imam said that. He said, beware that this vile man, the son of the vile man, has placed me between two choices. Between sword, silla, وَالذِّلَّةِ and humiliation. And hayhat means what? Away is zillat from me, Hussein ibn Ali. Zillat cannot come close to me. So indeed, from these two, what do I choose? Steadfastness and martyrdom. And similarly, Imam said in Karbala, إِن لَمْ يَكُنْ لَكُمْ دِينٌ وَلَا تَخَافُونَ الْمَعَادِ كُونُوا أَحْرَارًا فِي دُنْيَاكُمْ. When he spoke to Shimr and his people, he said, if you have no religion and you do not fear the hereafter, then at least be free and noble in your worldly life. So in reality, these statements of the Imam serve as evidence of his weariness with reproaching and rebuking them. It is as though they had resolved to prefer humiliation, abasement, and the wrath of the Lord over honor and dignity. So Imam shows his exhaustion from them, and through this continual admonition. In the following sentences, then Imam continues and points directly to their weakness. He says what? He says, إِذَا دَعَوْتُكُمْ إِلَى جَهَادِ أَدُوِّكُمْ دَارَتْ أَعْيُنُكُمْ كَأَنَّكُمْ مِنَ الْمَوْتِ فِي غَمْرَةٍ وَمِنَ الذُّهُولِ فِي سَكْرَةٍ يَرْتَجُ عَلَيْكُمْ حَوَارِي فَتَأْمَهُونَ. Right, that's the last. He said, when I call you for jihad against your enemy, your eyes involuntarily roll in their sockets out of fear, as though terror of death has robbed you of your senses and you have become, besides yourself, like intoxicated people. My repeated words do not penetrate your ears. For this reason, you have become bewildered and lost in finding the correct path of life. And that is why an imam is needed. In every institution, a leader is needed. A community, a state, a city, a country, there's a leader that is required. Imam is needed because you sometimes fall into this deception. So the word yartaju alaykum hawari, given that hawar means repeated speech, yartaju derives from the word rataja, means to be closed, admits of two meanings. First is what was stated above, namely that my repeated words have had no effect on you whatsoever. Imam Hussain said the same thing in Karbala. He said, I'm speaking to you directly. How come you're not having any effects of my words? Imagine someone of high influence in the world today, not me, like the marja of the time, comes and speaks to you directly. We have great respect for our maraja. Or better yet, imam of our time, he reappears and he comes and speaks to you directly. First, you'll feel honored. Number two, will you neglect his words? There's a possibility we might, because of all the rust that has settled on our hearts. Because Imam Hussain said the same thing. He's the imam of the time. He's speaking to the people of Kufa, yet they're not having any effects of the words of Imam. What does he say at the end? He said, I know why. لَأَنَّ بُطُونَكُمْ مُلِيَتْ بِالْحَرَامِ. Your bellies are filled with haram. The moment your bellies are filled with haram, that's what happens. This is the result of your bellies being filled with haram. So the first, Imam is continuously reproaching them without any effect. It is as though you do not understand them at all. There could be only one or two things. Either you don't want to understand or you definitely don't understand. Which one is it? Because the doors of comprehension have been closed to you. The second is that your tongues are closed when responding to me. You know what I'm saying, but tongues are tied up. You don't want to respond because you have no logical reply for my words. In any case, the result of both meanings is the same as was mentioned in the following sentences, namely their bewilderment. He says, وَكَأَنَّ, last sentence, وَكَأَنَّ قُلُوبُكُمْ مَأْلُوسَةٌ فَأَنْتُمْ لَا تَعْقِلُونَ. It is as though your minds have been taken away and you do not comprehend any things. Now, I'm done with the khutbah. But this last sentence, why all this rebuke and reproach. Sometimes you and I are also told to have patience, forbearance, when you're dealing with your community, when you're dealing with your people, your team, those whom you work with, those who are your subordinate. When you're dealing with them, be gentle, be kind. The khutbah mentioned, Imam was gentle with them. Imam was kind with them. Imam was compassionate with them. Only later on, he switched this gear. So why all this rebuke? Once again, we're compelled to address this question. Why does Imam, you and I might lose our cool. You and I might become, lose our patience with people, get angry. But Imam al-Muttaqeen is at the peak of all of this. For him, ayat such as وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. These are ayat revealed for Imam. كَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظَ, they suppress their anger. They, وَالْعَافِينَ, they forgive people. These ayat, misdaq of these ayat are Aimmat. Despite possessing such insight, awareness, and extraordinary leadership, subject the people of Kufa to so much rebuke and admonition, indeed with such very harsh expressions, would not all this reproach and expression of distrust toward them lead to alienation, resentment, fanaticism, and obstinacy on their part? No, they were already running away. But the Imam is speaking this way, they'll even further run away, right? So why did Imam, through these reproachful words, drive them even further, or farther rather, away from his objectives? In response to this question, it must be noted that Imam, through deep psychological insight, which you and I, not all have it, had thoroughly understood the temperaments of the Kufans. These are the same Kufans who will do the same thing to Imam Hassan. These are the same Kufans who will betray Imam Hussein. And so Imam knows their psychology, understands their temperament. As history shows, their condition was such that unless they saw their own identity on the brink of complete destruction, they would not be stirred. In other words, unless the lancet of rebuke and reproach was driven into the most sensitive nerves of their being, they would not move into action. Sometimes you need to strike that nerve. That string has to be stirred in order for them to feel it. Among human societies, one can always find a group, however small, that does not awaken until the final blow has fallen upon them. Imam knows the final blow is about to come. So before that comes, because of his ilm-e-ghaib and the knowledge of the unseen, he's rebuking them. So the meaning of Imam's words here is not that this method should be applied toward every negligent, heedless, and unaware group. And you and I should learn from this word of Imam and say, well, every time we see something like this, we should use this approach. Uffin lakum. We should say this to our people, those who are our subordinates. No, that's not what Imam is saying. For people differ. Some come to their senses with brief reproach. Few words will be enough to bring them forth. So to speak, with a mere gentle, gentler than a flower remark, or they find their path. Others, like an elephant, who will not move until the handler strikes its head with a hammer. Try moving an elephant. It's not easy. I don't know if this example was given. I've never dealt with elephants, but maybe that's how they are. First of all, they're huge, so you can't push them. It's not like a goat or a sheep. But if it decides not to move, you can't do anything. Unless the handler does what? Strikes them on their head with a hammer. Therefore, employing this method toward that particular group, don't use the hammer against, for example, a cow. Don't use the hammer, for example, against a dog. The smaller animals, you'll be able to drag them. Therefore, employing this method towards a particular group, is a form of remedy, is an appropriate approach, and a treatment unique to that particular situation. History shows us that these words were effective. A large group. So it wasn't in vain. When Imam said these words, uffin lakum, it wasn't in vain. In fact, it had impact on the people. Imam was able to strike that nerve. Imam was able to stir their emotions and to bring them on board. People of Kufa set out toward the camp of Nukhayla, which was near Kufa, and prepared to fight the rebels of Syria. However, with utmost regret, fate did not grant them respite, and the Imam was martyred by the sword stroke of the most wretched one later on, which is Ibn Muljam Muradi. Another evidence of this is that Imam, at the beginning of his rule, frequently praised the people of Kufa. But when they lapsed into lethargy and the soldiers of Muawiyah grew bold and began attacking parts of Islamic land day after day, Imam resorted to these harsh expressions. So the point that the commentator is trying to make over here is that don't use this one type of approach for everyone. This was specifically for the fabric of the people of Kufa that Imam had to use, and mashallah, Imam was able to bring them forward. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.